The equations were correct. The problem must lie elsewhere.
Alright, it's time to talk about the IBM Watson player power rankings for the Overwatch League. If you've watched OWL for any length of time this season, you've seen them all over the broadcasts, and if you're a Dallas Fuel fan, you've been super pumped about all your players basically occupying all the top spots. If you're not a Fuel fan, or maybe even if you are, you're probably wondering if those ratings are legit. Like, how could one team field all the best players in the league? That's not possible, is it? Or if it was, wouldn't it be like the 1992 U.S. Olympic Dream Team with Michael Jordan and Larry Bird and Magic Johnson and Christian Laettner that blew away all its competition en route to a gold medal? Dallas has a good record, but it's lost 4 games this season. Shouldn't a team with all the top talent pretty much win every game and do it by a lot like the Dream Team did? Well, that's what I'm going to try and figure out today. As soon as the first power rankings were introduced, rating the players from the 2020 season, I noticed a few patterns. Notably, there seemed to be a strong correlation between map wins and a player's rank, and also players from the same team tended to clump together. These both struck me as a little odd. Sure, you'd expect winning teams to have good players and maybe multiple good players, but all teams should have some good and some bad players. Think of your favorite sports team. You've probably got a few players who do great that you love, but there are probably some you wish would get benched or even released or traded. Likewise, a bad team might still have a star player or two who's just bogged down by his poor teammates. Even in sports like football, with the emphasis on team play, there's room for individual players to shine. For example, if you've watched NFL broadcasts recently, you've probably seen them show players' grades as determined by Pro Football Focus. Players on a team, even on units that you tend to think of as one single entity like the offensive line, tend to have ratings that are a little all over the place, or at least not as clumped together as closely as we see with the Fuel in the Overwatch League. I think Pro Football Focus influenced what the Overwatch League is trying to do with its rankings, but it might be that the very nature of Overwatch prevents them from painting a truly accurate picture of who the good and the bad players are. The first question we need to ask is, how are the power rankings determined? We don't know the exact formulas, but there are a few pieces of info out there, like how they track 360 stats and used advanced AI learning and so forth. But what we really need to know is this broad description we get from one of their articles. Watson's algorithm correlates those statistics and assigns a weight to each, determining how each factor tips the balance toward a win or a loss. So it sounds like the rankings use some pretty complex math, and they aren't just the kind of thing you could replicate by grabbing some basic stats and trying to match them all together. Or could you? For the first time, I actually downloaded the stats file for the Overwatch League and decided to see what kind of info I could get from it and whether I could get something that approximated the power rankings. I did this right after the June joust, so we're at precisely the midway point of the regular season. First of all, this thing is huge. I'd never done it before, never looked at it, and just, wow, it has 433,343 lines, each one representing a map, a player, a hero, and a stat. So I can see, for instance, how many ultimates Super used as Reinhardt on King's Row in a match on May 1st. He used 4. Or I can see how much damage Toby did to barriers as Lucio on Oasis on June 4th, and that was 2,804. I can also set up various filters to tabulate sets of stats to get totals so I know who's fired the most shots as Mercy. But anyway, enough playing around. Let's see if we can actually figure out something useful. Take a look at these two lists. One of them is the top damage players as determined by Watson, and another is a list as determined by a method I invented by parsing through that huge spreadsheet. Can you tell which is which? Well, you probably can, if only because you might know that Sparkle and Doa are rated 1 and 2 in the official rankings. So my list is on the right. Without that, though, you could probably look at my list and go, yeah, that's about right. They're not too different from each other, and it doesn't look like I've got some obviously bad player ranked highly or a great player ranked poorly. The players on my list use just 2 stats. Damage per 10 minutes, plus 500 times eliminations per 10 minutes. I chose 500 because 500 to 1 is about the ratio between damage and eliminations, so that way the 2 stats are weighted about equally. Now, my very simple system correlates to Watson's system to a 0.86 degree. If it was 1, it would be an exact correlation, so 0.86 is really close. I limited my stat to players with a minimum of 3 hours played, and I chose to do this with damage players because they have really the simplest role on a team. Do damage, get kills, and that's about it. Some can heal or block damage a little bit, but that's not really what they're there for. So what about all the Dallas players being ranked close to the top? At first I thought that was due to a very strong time played component in the rankings. Dallas has played a ton of maps, so I thought that Watson might be taking total damage or eliminations or something like that into account, as well as some averages. After looking at the data though, I'm not so sure about that. Players for Dallas and other top teams like Shanghai still rank near the top in their per 10-minute categories. When I saw that, I thought about how an Overwatch teamfight tends to go. You get one kill and it often snowballs from there, turning a 6v6 fight into a 6v5 fight. That's an advantage for your team that will probably lead to more damage and getting more kills. The main Dallas players work together as a team to record all those kills, so it makes some sense that they'd all have similar stats. Think of a quarterback in football that's at the top of the league rankings and whatever stats you like, yards, touchdowns, passer rating, whatever. That guy probably has at least one wide receiver who's also near the top. And if you rate offensive lines like Pro Football Focus does, that unit is also pretty high in terms of pass blocking. I think Overwatch works in a similar fashion, at least at the highest levels where everyone's playing together as a team. If one player is doing a lot of damage, for instance, it leads to opportunities for his teammates to pile on and accumulate stats of their own. Overwatch League teams that are winning are generally doing well in team fights, and just those brief openings that a single pick can make lead to more kills and higher averages than losing teams. But maybe this is where Watson's attempt to correlate stats with winning is a bit of a disadvantage. In some sense, it's double counting those things, and that's why sometimes it seems like the power rankings simply correspond with players and teams that are winning the most. And because of the nature of the game, because players on the same team tend to rack up roughly the same stats during team fights, it means that players for the same team tend to clump together a lot. In other words, there might not be a way to meaningfully separate players on the same team who play together all the time, like Sparkle and Doha, for example. Now, there are a few exceptions, and those might actually represent a significant difference between their stats, or it could mean that one of them plays much more or less than his teammate, and so they don't share their stats as much. When it comes down to it, I think all this serves to make the power rankings an interesting way to rate players. They work in the sense that they probably do correlate overall stats with winning, which is their stated goal, and it's hard in nearly any sport to separate individual performance from team success. To put it another way, Dallas might not have the best players, as in the best 5 or 6 overall players in the entire league, but it could very well have the best team because those players accumulate the best map-winning stats when they're together. In any case, if I was a GM looking for talent to add after the season, I don't know that I put too much faith in the rankings when I'm looking to hand out contracts. In closing, I just want to say this. Regardless of whether you think the power rankings are accurate or not, I think the Overwatch League is missing the mark a little bit with them. Even if you're a stat head who likes to know about WAR in baseball or player efficiency rating in basketball or other advanced stats, you sometimes just want to know how many home runs or points or touchdowns or whatever someone has. I feel like the Overwatch League has rushed ahead too quickly to try and present fancy advanced stats like the IBM Watson power rankings or the system Captain Planet we came up with last year without making much of an effort to provide more basic stats that fans could talk about. I mean, if you're a Dallas fan, which sounds cooler? That Sparkle's rating is 126? Or that he's averaging over 10,000 damage per 10 minutes? 10,000 damage is something you can wrap your head around. You and I do damage in Overwatch matches, so it's a concept that's more familiar and accessible. Personally, I'd rather see a top 10 or 20 or however many listing of how much damage players have done, or eliminations, or healing, or whatever, without having to fiddle with Stats Lab or hack through a spreadsheet with 500,000 lines to get to it. If the Overwatch League really wants to go mainstream, it's going to have to attract people who are used to more basic metrics like that. There's a place for advanced statistics, and I love them in other sports, but you have to start with a good foundation. And I feel like the league is trying to shoot for the moon before it figures out how to fly. What do you guys think? Do you like the power rankings? Do they seem to make sense to you and correspond with who you think the best players are? Or would you rather see a different system to rank players, or maybe one that might not be quite as accurate in terms of telling who exactly is the best player, but is more accessible and uses stats you're more familiar with? Leave me a comment to let me know what you think, and thank you so much for watching.